Hey guys, tonight we begin with a little journey back to the rolling hills, sleepy villages, and occasionally smelly mill streams of medieval Bohemia, what we now call the Czech Republic. So, dim the lights, tuck yourself in under your favorite blanket, and let's float gently into a world where the daily excitement consisted of watching grain tumble through a wooden mill and listening very carefully to water. Yes, water. It might not sound thrilling, but there's something soothing about it if you don't mind a faint whiff of wet hay and fermented grains. Back then, the miller wasn't just a person who ground flour. They were part scientist, part mystic, and part auditory connoisseur. Millers had to know when water was good, meaning it flowed consistently, wasn't too shallow, and didn't carry mysterious floating debris. Of course, medieval hydrology wasn't exactly taught in universities. The science, as it was, came from trial, error, and the occasional consultation of the village's resident wise woman. A miller would arrive at dawn, often in threadbare clothes that had seen too many winters, and listen. Not just casually, oh no. They would crouch near the sluice, ears straining for subtle variations in the gurgle of the stream. A rushing bubble here, a soft splat there. These were the Morse code of medieval milling. Good water meant a steady, consistent murmur, nothing too loud, nothing too timid. If it bubbled too aggressively, it could sweep the mill wheel out of alignment. If it whispered too faintly, the wheel might stop altogether, leaving the miller to sit awkwardly on the bank and hope the peasants wouldn't get impatient. Of course, it wasn't just a matter of listening. The miller also had to interpret the water's personality, which varied by season, rainfall, and sometimes the mood of the local forest spirits, if you believed the rumors. Autumn water was often lazy, sluggish, content to roll along without fuss. Spring water, after the thaw, was excitable, prone to tantrums, and occasionally a minor flood. Millers learned, through years of drudgery and mild anxiety, to anticipate these moods. Interestingly, the miller's reputation in the village hinged almost entirely on this ability to hear water correctly. Families would choose a mill for its flour based not only on convenience but on whether the miller seemed attuned to the river's song. Poor water listening skills could result in lumpy bread, or worse, a missed harvest window when grain sat too long and began to sprout. You might think of them as early audiophiles, but instead of judging music, they judged hydrodynamics. And naturally, every village had its favorite miller anecdotes. Old Janek, for instance, was famous for supposedly reading water like a book. Villagers would gather, partly for gossip, partly out of mild curiosity, to watch him kneel beside the mill race, listening with eyes closed, muttering to himself in a language that sounded suspiciously like, gurgle, gurgle, yes, this is acceptable. His assistants claimed he could hear the exact moment a wheel would turn wrong and correct it with a gentle nudge. Legend has it, he once prevented a mill collapse simply by flicking a plank with his toe. The story was probably exaggerated, but exaggeration is the gentle seasoning of historical sleep tales, and we'll allow it. Millers were also particularly superstitious about water quality. Stones or sticks in the wheel mechanism weren't always just accidents. Sometimes, they were signs of dissatisfaction from the river spirits. Pouring a small amount of beer into the water as an offering was considered prudent. Beer, after all, was both a staple and a mild sedative. And so, the miller would quietly toast the stream, whispering apologies, hoping the wheel would turn more pleasantly the next day. It probably didn't do much, but it helped him feel like he was contributing to cosmic order. Water listening wasn't purely mystical, though. It also required acute attention to detail, which is surprisingly rare in an era where most people were preoccupied with taxes, plague, or avoiding the local lord's inexplicable anger. A skilled miller could detect slight changes in flow caused by upstream beavers, yes, beavers, minor erosion, or the arrival of new sediment after a heavy rain. They developed a vocabulary, mostly mental, of the tones and rhythms of good versus bad water. There were high-pitched rushes that suggested too much friction and low, throaty gurgles indicating stagnation. Through subtle variations, the miller could make minor adjustments to the sluices to keep the grain grinding smoothly. In some ways, the water-listening miller was a proto-engineer. They didn't have blueprints, hydraulics manuals, or YouTube tutorials. They had intuition honed through repetition, patience, and the occasional mild humiliation when a wheel froze or a sack of flour got damp. But their work mattered. Flour quality was directly tied to village nutrition. A poorly milled loaf could result in sad breakfasts, grumbling families, and, if prolonged, mild cases of famine. So, in a very low-key, underappreciated way, millers were the custodians of survival. Naturally, the life of a miller came with minor occupational hazards. Wet feet were almost guaranteed, as were stubbed toes, splintered planks, and the occasional suspicious smell that no one wanted to investigate too closely. Illnesses were common, particularly in winter when hypothermia or mild frostbite became a slow, creeping problem. Still, millers rarely left their posts. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was necessary, and there was a meditative quality to the routine. The repetitive sound of the wheel, the endless listening, the gentle, predictable hum of moving water, it all contributed to a sort of quiet, unexciting zen that we can appreciate even now. Speaking of sound, one particularly meticulous miller, old Bohumil, kept a journal of water noises, which, of course, we only partially understand today. He used vague terms like pleasant trickle or agitated murmur, but historians have pieced together that he was likely documenting seasonal shifts and minor environmental changes. The journal was essentially a medieval field guide to stream acoustics, though written in a hand that required squinting, patience, and a willingness to ignore occasional smudges of flour. Bohumil's notes became so revered that other millers would travel miles just to consult them, partly for practical advice, partly because everyone loves a good spreadsheet of natural sounds. Village politics sometimes intruded on the miller's water listening. Local lords occasionally imposed arbitrary water taxes, measured in fractions of a river's flow. Millers had to comply, often measuring water levels in secret, whispering numbers to themselves so that the tax collector would leave them alone. It was a subtle, quiet form of resistance. Keep the mill running, keep the village fed, and avoid unnecessary confrontation. No one wrote songs about it, but it mattered. Even within the miller's household, water listening had subtle social implications. Families respected the miller not just for their skill, but for their patience. A miller who lost focus, who ignored the gentle cues of the stream, could jeopardize the household's reputation. Children might learn the basics. Listen, the wheel sings differently today, or the stream is grumpy, watch your step. So, the profession passed knowledge quietly from parent to child, often through gentle reminders rather than formal lessons. Interestingly, water listening culture influenced architecture. Mills were often designed with little nooks, raised platforms, or sound-concentrating sluices to help amplify the subtle tones of flowing water. If a miller wanted to, they could practically hear every pebble, every sediment swirl, without stepping foot outside the door. You might call it obsessive, but it also demonstrates how seriously medieval people could take even the smallest details. Let's drift over to a slightly more famous example. The mill at Krivoklat, situated near the Bohemian forest, was known for its particularly whimsical streams. Water flowed with a series of sharp drops and gentle curves, creating a melody that a skilled miller could almost play. One miller, Ludwig, was noted for humming along with the stream, adjusting sluices almost like a conductor directing an orchestra. This might sound slightly eccentric, but in reality, it helped maintain efficiency. The water responded better to gentle nudges than abrupt alterations, and perhaps the occasional hum reminded Ludwig that he existed in a quiet, patterned world, a soothing thought in the harsh medieval climate. By this point, you might be wondering why anyone would devote so much attention to a relatively small stream. But remember, medieval communities had few constants. Weather was unpredictable, lords were irritable, and disease was always lurking. Water, for all its capriciousness, offered a rhythm, a pattern that one could study, anticipate, and manipulate. For the miller, this was not just work. It was a meditation, a slow dance with nature that rewarded patience. And so, the life of a medieval Czech miller was defined by listening. Not reading, not shouting, not arguing, just listening. Every day, they crouched, knee-deep in minor splashes, to hear the subtle symphony of good water. Villagers depended on them, Historians now marvel at their attention to detail, and you, dear listener, can drift off to sleep imagining a slow, murky stream, a creaking wooden wheel, and the quiet satisfaction of a task well done. Helena was one of the few known women millers in medieval Bohemia, though the records describe her in the usual faintly dismissive tone. Widow of a miller, continued the trade out of necessity, as though necessity somehow disqualified skill. Yet villagers quietly admitted, when no clerks were listening, that Helena's flour was the softest for miles and her mill wheel ran more smoothly than any operated by the region's more self-important men. She managed a small mill tucked near a bend of the Ore River, where the flow was gentler, more hesitant, almost shy. It suited her temperament perfectly. Helena was known for her patience. She seldom raised her voice, even when the river chose to behave unpredictably, which happened more often than anyone wanted to admit. She treated each nuance of the water's sound like a familiar voice from an old friend. If the flow burbled too quickly, she would hum under her breath and adjust the gate with slow, deliberate motions. If the river hesitated, she would wait, hand resting lightly on the wooden beam, as though reassuring it that everything was, in fact, fine. Her mornings began with sweeping the mill floor, a habit she claimed helped her hear better. Dust, stray husks, tiny crumbs, all these little intrusions interfered, she said, with the acoustics of the room. And so, the mill was always remarkably clean, despite the endless dusty chaos of grinding grain. Visitors often noted the soft echo of each footstep, the faint whisper of the wheel, and the gentle trickle of water running beneath the boards. It gave the place a strangely contemplative atmosphere, as though stepping inside required everyone to lower their voice and respect the quiet. The villagers called her Helena the Listener, a title that sounds somewhat poetic, though it mostly meant she was the person who spent the most time crouched next to the water. Unlike some millers, Helena didn't talk to the river directly. She simply listened. Her silence was respectful, calm, and steady. If something was wrong, she would make small adjustments without fuss. The mill wheel never jerked or groaned. Instead, it turned with a muted, rhythmic consistency that felt slightly hypnotic. One of Helena's peculiar habits was watching the shadow of the mill wheel instead of the wheel itself. She claimed that the shadow revealed inconsistencies more clearly. If the rhythm faltered, even for a moment, the shadow would wobble, creating a kind of visual whisper, subtle, quiet, but unmistakable once noticed. Children from the village sometimes gathered in the doorway to watch this silent performance, trying to see what Helena saw. Most didn't succeed, of course, but Helena would smile softly and encourage them anyway. Another of her methods involved a thin strip of linen, almost like a ribbon, tied to a small peg near the sluice. The fabric fluttered in the breeze created by the wheel's motion, and Helena could tell by the angle or movement whether the water was too fast or too slow. It seems unimpressive in modern terms, but in a world without instruments, a fluttering linen strip was as useful as a gauge. She could read it with uncanny accuracy, nodding slightly as if confirming information she already suspected. While many millers relied on the sound of the river, Helena had a special ear for the wheel's creaks. Each wooden paddle produced a slightly different note, and she memorized them all. If one sounded strained, she knew exactly which peg needed tightening. If another seemed unusually quiet, she suspected either water buildup or debris caught in a groove. Her ability to diagnose issues simply by listening impressed even the grumpiest villagers. They brought grain to her mill not just for flour quality, but for the comforting belief that Helena always knew what she was doing. Her quiet precision extended beyond milling. Helena kept a garden near the mill's edge, where she grew herbs that supposedly encouraged steady hands and steady minds. The villagers joked that her herbs worked better on water than on people. The truth was simpler. Tending the plants gave her something predictable to do while listening to the wheel. It was a rhythm within a rhythm, soft leaves rustling, water murmuring, stones clicking gently as the wheel turned. One aspect the villagers found particularly fascinating was Helena's ability to sense changes before they happened. Storm clouds gathering upstream? She would know from a subtle drop in water temperature. Beavers constructing an unwelcome dam? She would detect a muffled irregularity in the flow. Ice forming on winter mornings? She could hear the faint click of freezing layers before anyone saw them. This quiet foresight lent her an almost mystical aura, though she insisted it was just careful observation. Historians later found fragments of Helena's notes, written in neat, small script on rough parchment. She rarely described events directly. Instead, she recorded water textures, light and absent, thick with morning chill, cooperative, resistant, and even half asleep. Each term captured a feeling, an auditory impression, rather than a scientific measurement. Scholars have since tried to decode her descriptions into modern hydraulic terms, but most agree that Helena simply understood water on a poetic level. And sometimes poetry describes the physical world more accurately than numbers. One of the more endearing things about Helena was her calm confidence. She didn't boast or seek attention. When someone complimented her craftsmanship, she merely shrugged and said, "The river does most of the work." It wasn't false humility, she truly believed it. The river flowed whether she was there or not. Her task was simply to pay attention, respond gently, and let the water behave as it wanted within the boundaries of the mill's needs. This perspective made her unusually patient during drought years. When water levels dipped dangerously low, other millers panicked, adjusting their gates frantically or arguing with neighbors about water rights. Helena, by contrast, would stand by the sluice and listen to the faint trickle. If the water couldn't support full milling, she slowed production. Villagers didn't complain, because everyone understood that the river dictated the pace, not human impatience. During floods, her calm approach became even more evident. She never tried to resist the river's force. She simply raised the sluices, allowed the water to pass freely, and waited until it calmed. Records indicate that her mill suffered almost no flood damage across decades, a rare achievement in a region prone to spring runoffs. Other millers eventually adopted her strategy, though none executed it with her gentle consistency. Helena also had a subtle sense of humor, though it was so quiet that many villagers missed it entirely. For example, she once tied a small carved wooden fish to the sluice gate. When asked why, she said, "It's for the river to speak to, so it doesn't need to complain to me." The answer was delivered with a perfectly straight face, sending the poor farmer into a mild existential crisis about whether rivers truly needed conversational partners. Another time, she sprinkled a pinch of flour into the water, then waited thoughtfully before saying, "It prefers rye today." Whether this was true or a gentle joke, no one could tell. But it added a certain charm to the daily rhythm of the mill. Despite her calm demeanor, Helena wasn't immune to the frustrations of milling life. Once, after a particularly stubborn log wedged itself under the wheel, she spent an entire hour nudging it with a long pole, sighing softly each time it refused to move. She never raised her voice, but each sigh became slightly heavier, like a weary complaint to the universe. When the log finally drifted free, she simply said, "Thank you," to no one in particular. Helena's interactions with villagers were brief but polite. She didn't gossip, didn't meddle, didn't boast about her work. She delivered flour, offered quiet advice when asked, and returned to her wheel. Yet villagers trusted her implicitly. If she said the river would run slowly tomorrow, they planned accordingly. If she warned that the water was unsettled, they expected small inconveniences. The miller's uncanny accuracy became a stabilizing force in the community, quiet, steady, reliable. One of the more touching aspects of Helena's life was her mentorship of a young girl named Eliska, who showed curiosity about the mill's workings. Helena taught her not through instruction but through presence. They listened together, watched shadows on the wall, observed how water reacted to small changes in the gate. Helena explained things in simple, gentle phrases, like, "The water is telling us it's tired," or, "Today it wants us to slow down." Eliska absorbed every word, eventually becoming a skilled assistant in her own right. Years later, Eliska inherited the mill and continued Helena's traditions, maintaining the quiet rituals, the shadow watching, the linen strip fluttering in the breeze. And though she lacked Helena's uncanny foresight, she preserved the philosophy, listen first, act second, force nothing. Helena's mill stood for many generations. Even after the building eventually collapsed from age long after her death, Villagers continued to refer to the riverside path as Helena's Quiet Bend. The name persisted in local memory, then in folk songs, then finally in historical records. It was a gentle legacy, not dramatic, not heroic, but peaceful and steady, like the water she listened to every day. And so Helena reminds us that medieval life wasn't always chaotic. Sometimes it was rhythm, quiet, patience, and the soft murmur of water turning a humble wheel. If you've ever wandered through your house in the early morning, half awake, holding your phone like a torch as you try not to stumble over whatever object life has inconveniently placed in your path, you've essentially recreated the job of an entire profession in the Abbasid world, the lantern keepers. Yes, this was a real job. Yes, people trained for it. And yes, they took it far more seriously than you and your 6% battery ever will. So, in this chapter, we're drifting into the quiet, almost meditative world of the Abbasid night, long after the call to prayer has faded, long after the palace scribes have stopped grinding ink, and just as the city settles into that deep hush that only truly ancient cities could achieve. While you settle into your pillow, let's meander through the lives of the people who kept the darkness from swallowing Baghdad whole. The slow glow of the city. To imagine Abbasid nights, you have to erase a few modern habits from your mind. No bright streetlights. No glowing screens. No headlights from impatient commuters. No fluorescent signs suggesting a sale on anything. Instead, picture a city lit mostly by oil lamps, glowing like tiny amber stars hanging from wooden beams. The air carried the faint, earthy scent of olive oil burning, mixed with the cool dust of the Tigris drifting through the streets. That's where the lantern keepers stepped in. These individuals, usually men trained by guild-like groups, had one singular purpose: to make sure the city didn't melt into pitch-black uncertainty each night. They patrolled main avenues, palace walkways, and the quiet roads leading to administrative buildings, checking oil reserves, trimming wicks, and replacing cracked glass housings. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady work. And in an era obsessed with both order and symbolism, the job carried surprising dignity. Why lantern keepers mattered more than you'd expect. The Abbasid state adored structure and ritual. Everything had its place, from the arrangement of palace courtyards to the cataloging of library scrolls. Letting the city go dark felt like letting the empire fall apart, even if only a little. You can imagine the lantern keepers thinking, "Ah yes, the caliph rules the empire, and I, personally, rule this specific stretch of hallway." At night, when the rest of the palace staff retreated to their chambers, the lantern keepers became the guardians of both safety and symbolism. They illuminated pathways to prayer rooms, long library corridors, guest routes for visiting diplomats too polite to complain but absolutely lost, and the small courtyards where household staff whispered gossip they absolutely shouldn't be whispering. Light meant reliability. Reliability meant confidence. Confidence meant stability. And stability meant the caliph slept well, which meant everyone slept well. See? Complex geopolitical domino effect. They're tools of the trade. A lantern keeper rarely worked empty-handed. A wooden pole with a hook for raising lanterns, a pouch of spare wicks, a small pot of thickened oil, a cloth for soot wiping, and, occasionally, a stick for gently discouraging overexcited cats from knocking things over. Their lantern inspection routines were astonishingly systematic. Some accounts describe a set sequence. First the wick length, never too long, never too short, then the clarity of the oil, then the lantern's glass, and finally the stability of its hanging bracket. If anything was off, even slightly, they fixed it. Because nothing says professional pride like adjusting a wick at 2 in the morning while muttering about someone else's sloppy maintenance. The sound of the Abbasid night. While the lantern keepers made their rounds, the city didn't sleep entirely. There were faint sounds drifting through the night that formed a kind of gentle soundtrack. The distant plop of fishermen on the Tigris. The soft clacking of a late-night potter finishing an order. A camel somewhere making a noise that sounded vaguely judgmental. Someone reciting poetry alone, because this was the Abbasid world and of course someone was reciting poetry alone. Against this tapestry of quiet noises, the lantern keeper's steps were slow and steady. They worked deliberately, rhythmically, their movements spaced enough to lull anyone, perhaps even you, into a gentle stupor. Why they remained invisible, and why that was the point. Lantern keepers lived in a strange duality, essential but unnoticed. If everything was perfect, no one saw them. If something went wrong, well, suddenly everyone noticed. They were the custodians of a nighttime order that no one spoke about because it was too normal, too expected. But that's exactly what makes them fascinating. Their job wasn't dramatic, heroic, or particularly creative. It was simply steady, predictable, quiet. Exactly the sort of history that helps your brain ease into sleep. Because there's something deeply soothing about the idea that hundreds of years ago, in a sprawling city of scholars, merchants, and dreamers, there were people walking through cool, dark hallways ensuring that flame after flame stayed gently alive. And so, the night deepens. As the lantern keepers finished their circuits, usually just before the first hints of dawn, they checked their routes one final time. Wicks trimmed, oil-topped, lanterns glowing, the city still breathing softly in the darkness. Then they returned to wherever lantern keepers slept, probably with the comforting knowledge that they had kept the night smooth and uneventful. If Chapter 4 was all about the gentle glow of lamps, then Chapter 5 is about something even quieter, even softer, even more essential: water. Not rushing water. Not dramatic water. Not tsunami-level water. No, this is the kind of water that trickles, that drips, that sits in clay jars settling into cool silence. The kind of water that makes you more sleepy simply by existing. Welcome to the world of the Abbasid Palace water-bearers, the soft-footed custodians who carried calm through the night. The subtle importance of water in an ancient palace. In an Abbasid palace, water wasn't just water. It was temperature control. It was ritual purity. It was hospitality. It was medicine. It was symbolism. It was, well, the Abbasids really liked giving deep symbolic value to things. And it meant a whole system was built around ensuring that no corridor, no servant hall, no library annex, and no quiet chamber of a half-awake scholar ever ran out of fresh water. Enter the water-bearers. They weren't flashy. They weren't dramatic. They were the human equivalent of a background hum. But like many of the quiet workers of the Abbasid world, the palace needed them more than anyone openly admitted. Their midnight rounds. You might think water carrying happened during the day. Nope. Too hot. Too busy. Too many people yelling about scrolls or pigeons or treaties or other administrative crises. Night was perfect. Still focused. Water-bearers began their routes just after sunset, carrying large, curved ceramic jugs or goatskin water bags. They moved slowly, stepping carefully so the water inside didn't slosh too loudly. The goal was always to be unheard, because nothing ruins palace serenity like the audible sound of someone jogging with a jiggling water skin. So they paced themselves. Measured. Almost meditative. If you imagine someone walking through a palace with a giant pitcher of water as if performing a very slow yoga ritual, you're pretty much there. Where the water actually came from. Most of the palace water came from one of three places. The Tigris, carried in and purified in large cisterns. Deep palace wells, dug centuries earlier. Underground channels, carefully maintained and occasionally cursed at by whoever was responsible for crawling into them. The cisterns were the heart of the system, huge, echoing spaces where water cooled naturally. Water-bearers filled their jugs here, sometimes pausing to listen to the quiet dripping within the chamber. It was said that if you listen long enough, you could hear the palace breathing. Probably just condensation, but don't ruin the romance. Tools of the trade. Water-bearers carried a large jug or water skin, a small cloth for wiping condensation, a wooden dipper, a wax seal to indicate a jug was filled under palace supervision, and sometimes a short stick, not for defense but for gently knocking on doors to avoid startling whoever was inside. Their job required balance, patience, and a deep understanding of the palace layout. Some routes were simple, wide halls, flat stone floors. Others were less elegant. Think uneven steps. Random decorative niches. Dark corners where a cat might be sleeping, or awake and judging you. or awake and planning to judge you. The late-night consumers of palace water. A surprising number of people needed water in the middle of the night. Scholars working on astronomical tables. Cooks preparing dough for dawn meals. Guards who pretended they didn't fall asleep. Messengers waiting for late-night instructions. Insomniac poets, there were always poets. And the occasional wandering diplomat lost again because palaces are essentially labyrinths with better lighting. To these people, the water-bearers were small miracles, quiet figures appearing from the dimness, offering a dipper of cool water and a moment of stillness. Imagine a tiny sip echoing in a vast stone hall. Enough to keep someone awake or lull someone toward sleep. Water performing its eternal balancing act. Their relationship with silence. If the lantern keepers embraced the calm of light, the water-bearers embraced silence. They learned how to shift their weight so sandals didn't scuff, refill vessels smoothly to avoid splashing, cushion jugs against their hip, and breathe slowly to match the rhythm of their steps. Some joked that the water-bearers moved like ghosts. Others joked that they moved like administrators avoiding responsibility. Both are fair. A palace in stillness. Picture it. A cool corridor. Clay tiles underfoot. A faint moonbeam sliding across a blue mosaic wall. The palace asleep, except for the soft hiss of oil lamps and the gentle whisper of poured water. One water-bearer pauses, checks his jug, adjusts his grip, and continues on. Slow, quiet, peaceful. The kind of scene that makes your breathing get deeper just by imagining it. The dawn ritual. Just before sunrise, the water-bearers completed their final rounds. They checked the cistern levels, sealed the storage jars, and noted which chambers would need refilling the next evening. Then, like the lantern keepers, they vanished into the living tapestry of the palace staff. Their night's work had been steady, calm, borderline hypnotic. The kind of work that makes your eyelids heavy just thinking about it. And that is the power of these invisible professionals, maintaining order not through drama or heroism, but through slow, dependable motion. Much like the rhythm you're probably sinking into right now. If water-bearers kept the palace hydrated and lantern keepers kept it glowing, then the next group kept it aesthetically soothing in a very specific, very niche way, the fountain tuners. Yes, that was a real job. Yes, it was exactly as sleepy as it sounds. And yes, they took it extremely seriously, because in an Abbasid palace, the sound of water wasn't just decoration. It was mood management. Why a fountain needed tuning. Most people imagine fountains as static structures. Water goes up, water comes down, end of story. But in the Abbasid courts, where scholars, poets, engineers, and astrologers all lived one hallway away from each other, water sounds were a kind of acoustic therapy. Too loud, and a courtyard became stressful. Too soft, and the water feature was basically decorative pottery. Too bubbly, and someone would accuse the fountain of lacking dignity. Too splashy, and it might accidentally insult a visiting official who interpreted everything symbolically. So, the fountains had to be tuned. Gently. Late at night. When the palace was quiet enough to hear tiny variations in water flow. When the fountains were tuned. Always at night. Always after the heat had faded. Always when the courtyard tiles had cooled enough to release that faint mineral smell that radiates sleepiness. The fountain tuners moved through the palace like wandering monks armed with ceramic bowls, long spoons, tiny chisels, and the kind of patience only found in people who listen to dripping water for a living. Their job, adjust the angle of spouts, the height of water pressure, the shape of the rims, and the placement of the stones in the basin. Because the right ripple pattern mattered. It mattered a lot. The palace's different fountain personalities. Every major courtyard had a fountain with its own intended mood. Some were designed for deep thought, soft trickling, gentle curves, no drama. Some were designed for casual poetry recitations, just enough sound to feel artistic, but not enough to drown out the poet complaining about their patrons. Others were intended for diplomatic discussions, where the flow needed to be neutral and calming so guests wouldn't overthink a metaphorical message. And yes, the palace did worry about the message of water. If a fountain splashed too harshly, someone might interpret it as a subtle political insult. If it gurgled strangely, someone might accuse it of foreshadowing economic instability. So, the tuner's job was to make the fountain sound like, well, nothing controversial. Just soothing background white noise. Liquid tranquility. The sonic equivalent of a long exhale. The tools of a fountain tuner. Their tools were humble. Clay wedges to redirect flow. Reed segments for testing pressure. Wax-coated cloth to muffle problem spots. Flat stones to shape ripples. A long-handled brush to smooth mineral buildup. A tiny oil lamp that somehow made them look both mystical and mildly inconvenienced. They also carried an unofficial tool, a deep understanding of palace drama. If they knew a particular emir was sulking about tax reforms, they softened the fountains in his wing. If a poet was writing a melancholy epic, they tilted a spout for a slightly more wistful note. Customized water ambience. Luxury at its quietest. How they judged a fountain's mood. The tuners didn't take measurements. No numerical water pressure scales. No charts. No diagrams. Just the ear. They listened. Head slightly tilted. Eyes half closed. Expression somewhere between deeply contemplative and almost asleep while standing. They listened to the pitch of falling droplets, the echo off the basin, the bounce of water hitting water, the resonance against stone, and the faint tremble in the surrounding tiles. If a tuner frowned, it meant the fountain was too abrupt. If a tuner nodded slowly, it meant the fountain was cooperative. If a tuner sighed, it meant someone in the palace had messed with it earlier. Most culprits? Bored noble children who liked splashing. They caused more acoustic damage than minor earthquakes. The politics of palace quiet. In a palace where political tension rose and fell like the Tigris, sound mattered. Calm courtyards kept officials from overreacting. Calm courtyards kept scholars from spiraling into philosophical arguments. Calm courtyards kept poets from getting dramatic about nothing. Well, less dramatic, relatively speaking. So the fountain tuners became accidental diplomats. They didn't negotiate treaties. They didn't settle disputes. But they kept the environment smooth, which, honestly, did half the work. A quiet space can prevent an argument. A well-tuned fountain can prevent three. The late-night atmosphere. Picture a courtyard just before dawn. Cool air. Soft moonlight. An oil lamp flickering gently against carved stone. A fountain tuner stands knee-deep in patience, holding a clay wedge, slowly adjusting the angle of a spout so the water stops hissing and becomes more whispering. It's the sort of job that requires the emotional energy of a sleepy librarian and the concentration of someone stirring soup very slowly so it doesn't spill. Most of the palace never noticed the tuners. But everyone benefited from them. Finishing their shift. As the sky paled from black to blue, the tuners completed their final rounds. A last adjustment. A final ear tilt. A small nod. And then they slipped away before dawn prayers, blending back into the silent machinery of palace life. Their work was invisible but essential. Quiet but impactful. Much like the ripples in the fountain basins, soft, steady, and endlessly repeating. Perfect for drifting deeper into that late-night haze. Now let's drift back toward the world of medieval Czech lands again, not the millers this time, but the people who kept their mills alive, the millwrights. If millers listened for good water, millwrights listened for everything else a mill could do wrong. And since watermills were basically wooden clocks powered by unpredictable rivers, things went wrong constantly. But the millwrights took it all in stride, in that uniquely calm, mildly exasperated medieval way. The millwright's realm. A medieval millwright's workshop wasn't really a workshop so much as a scattered collection of tools arranged wherever they happened to lie. Shavings on the floor. Rope coils leaning against a post. A half-finished gear. And always that faint smell of wet wood. They were responsible for carving gears, fitting axles, shaping paddles, checking the weight of the millstones, tightening joints, fixing leaks, and occasionally convincing the river to cooperate. They were engineers before engineering became a formal discipline, working with intuition, wood grain, and whatever the river felt like doing that day. They didn't get praise. They barely got thanks. But without them, mills sat silently like confused wooden animals waiting for someone to poke them into motion. A very slow, very patient craft. Millwrighting required patience. A level of patience usually only seen in people waiting for soup to cool or monks copying manuscripts. Shaping a wheel could take days. Carving a gear tooth could take hours. Aligning the gears so they didn't grind themselves to dust? That was practically an act of meditation. Some millwrights joked that nature used mill gears as stress tests. If you were too frustrated, the wood would crack. If you were calm, the wood stayed calm too. It was basically medieval emotional support carpentry. Listening to the mill like a living being. Millwrights didn't just hear a mill. They listened to it like a doctor listening to a heartbeat. A soft clicking noise meant the grain feed was too dry. A slow groan meant the axle was settling oddly. A faint squeal meant the paddle wheel wanted attention. A quiet grinding meant someone forgot to oil something again. They could even diagnose problems through the floorboards. Just imagine a millwright standing inside a mill, eyes half closed, palm resting against a timber beam, head tilted like a sleepy philosopher. Nearly motionless. Listening to the world's slowest music. If the mill sounded wrong, the millwright corrected it. If the mill sounded right, the millwright quietly walked home and took a nap. Tools of the millwright. They weren't fancy. A medieval millwright's toolkit was basically chisels, spurs, wedges, a wooden mallet, square, tree resin, a lantern that always looked slightly tired. But the real tool was experience. Knowing how wood swelled in rain. Knowing how river moods changed through the seasons. Knowing the difference between normal mill noise and the gears have decided to argue with each other again. None of this was written down. It was memorized, learned slowly, apprenticed carefully, and passed on through generations like a very quiet family secret. The emotional life of the mill. This may sound odd, but medieval people genuinely believed mills had personalities. Some mills were obedient. Some were temperamental. Some were lazy after rain. Some were overly energetic in spring. A good millwright treated the mill's moods with the calm neutrality of a parent who has accepted that their child will never stop asking questions. And honestly, they weren't wrong. Mills did change personality depending on humidity, temperature, the weight of the millstones, the softness of the grain, and the river's general moodiness. A millwright had to account for all of it. Quietly, patiently, preferably while barefoot so they could feel the vibrations. Yes, barefoot engineering. Very advanced. Seasonal adjustments. Every season required tuning. Spring. Snowmelt rushed in. The river got overeager. Mills spun a little too enthusiastically. Millwrights did a lot of tightening. Summer. Dry spells slowed the wheel. Mills became sleepy. Millwrights added weight, adjusted flow, and pretended to be surprised every year. Autumn. Floods, humidity, swollen beams. The mill creaked like an old noble complaining about taxes. Millwrights sighed and did their best. Winter. The river froze. Nothing worked. Millwrights stayed inside carving replacement parts and waiting for life to resume. A cycle of tranquility, inconvenience, and gentle problem-solving. Repairs done in peace. Most repairs were done alone. Just the millwright, a lantern, the river outside, and the creak of wood. Millwrights enjoyed this solitude. Not that they'd ever admit it, but it was the one place where no one bothered them. No villagers asking about grain prices. No millers complaining about ghosts in the attic. No children trying to ride the wheel like it was a carnival attraction. Just calm work, slow breathing, and the steady rhythm of chiseling. The relationship between millwrights and millers. Millers respected millwrights. And feared them, slightly. Because millwrights knew where every weakness in the mill was, and they also knew exactly who caused it. If the mill groaned in a certain way, a millwright could immediately tell whether the miller overloaded the hopper, the miller used grain that was too damp, or the miller simply ignored the millwright's last instructions. And millers hated being called out. So millwrights spoke softly, chose their words carefully, and delivered criticism with that calm tone of someone too tired to argue. Most disagreements dissolved into shrugging. Everyone went back to work. The mill kept turning. Life kept moving at a steady, sleepy pace. Evening at the mill. Picture the end of a millwright's day. The sun dipping behind the river. The wheel turning lazily. Dust hanging in the air like a faded halo. The last creak of wood fading into evening silence. The millwright packs their tools, pats the wheel support like someone saying, "Good job," and walks home through the quiet fields. It's all so slow. So uneventful. So profoundly gentle. Exactly the kind of history that helps your eyelids drift lower. Let's float over to another group who lived at the edge of medieval Czech water culture, the river watchers. Not glamorous guardians. Not dramatic heroes. More like calm, mildly bored caretakers who stood beside rivers at night making sure nothing inconvenient happened. If the millers listened for good water, and the millwrights listened for cooperative wood, the river watchers listened for the river's mood. And since rivers have moods the way cats have opinions, loud, quiet, and occasionally spiteful, this job required a kind of quiet attentiveness that pairs perfectly with sleepy storytelling. Why rivers needed watching? You might think a river just exists, flows, does its river thing. But medieval Czech rivers were central to everything. Grain transport, mill power, town boundaries, fishing rights, and the general sense of, will the bridge survive this year? So someone needed to keep an eye on them, especially at night when a sudden rise, or a drifting log, or an early ice sheet could surprise everyone in the worst way. River watchers didn't prevent disasters. They simply noticed them early enough that someone else could panic later. It was a quiet chain of responsibility. Perfectly medieval. Perfectly bureaucratic. Perfectly sleepy. The typical night shift. A river watcher's night wasn't dramatic. It involved slow walking, slower pacing, leaning on a stick, listening to the water, occasionally muttering at the river like it might listen, and generally waiting for nothing to happen. Because a good night for a river watcher was one where the river did absolutely nothing interesting. Too interesting meant trouble. A sudden swirl? Potential debris. A loud crack? Ice forming or breaking. A weird bubbling? Probably harmless, unless it wasn't, but it usually was. A faint slosh against a piling? Time to sigh deeply and make a note for the miller. Tools of the river watcher. Their toolkit was a collection of mildly useful objects. A lantern. A long stick for poking things. A short rope for pulling things. A water gauge carved into the dock or bank. A wooden tablet for notes. And a small knife, mostly used for bread, not heroism. But their most important tool was their sense of hearing, tuned to the subtle language of moving water. River watchers could distinguish between water hitting a stone, water hitting a branch, water hitting a mill wheel, and water hitting a misplaced fishing basket someone forgot to tether. That last one caused more morning arguments than winter frost. Water level checking rituals. This wasn't scientific. No neat scales. No precise measurement logs in the way modern hydrologists dream of. A carved marking on a post, a thin stick to gauge depth, and the river watcher's memory of last night's reading. Was the river a finger width higher? They'd note it calmly. Was it 2 finger widths higher? They'd take a slower breath, then note it calmly. Was it 3? Well, they might walk a little faster to tell the miller, but only a little. No rushing. Medieval professionalism required a slow pace. Even potential flooding was approached with a tone of, that is inconvenient. Let me go inform someone before it becomes even more inconvenient. The emotional relationship with the river. Much like millwrights treated mills as moody companions, river watchers forged emotional relationships with the river. Not dramatic, not poetic, just a quiet understanding. They respected its temperament. They accepted its unpredictability. They observed its sulks, its enthusiasm, its late-night restlessness. Some watchers claimed to know when the river was planning trouble. Others claimed the river was perfectly reasonable as long as you didn't bother it. Both beliefs worked. Both beliefs contributed to calm nights. And both beliefs helped maintain the illusion that the river could be tamed with attentiveness. It couldn't. But the effort was charming. Seasonal moods of Czech River's spring. The drama season. Snowmelt rushed in like a guest who arrived early and refused to knock. The river watchers doubled their rounds. Everything gurgled louder. Everyone pretended to be surprised. Summer, the lazy season. Water levels dropped. The river moved at a leisurely crawl. Watchers, too, adopted a slower pace, leaning on railings with the air of someone guarding a sleeping cat. Autumn, the moody season. Rains came and went unpredictably. The river alternated between thoughtful quiet and sudden irritation. Watchers sighed more than usual. Winter, the whisper season. Ice formed. Water stilled. Sound softened. Most nights were so quiet that watchers could hear frost forming on driftwood. Winter river duty was boring in the highest, sleepiest sense of the word. The watchers' quiet warnings. When something did go wrong, river watchers rarely raised alarms dramatically. They preferred gentle knocking on doors, soft-spoken warnings. The river seems a bit restless tonight. Or, you may want to check the south wheel in the morning. Even in emergencies, they avoided urgency. It was considered rude to wake a miller in a panic unless the river was literally in the house. And even then, the tone stayed calm. Yes, the water has entered the cellar. No rush, but perhaps we should move the grain. Medieval crisis management at its most tranquil. Quiet fans of the night. River watchers liked working after dark. The world shrank down to the sound of water, the glow of a lone lantern, the silhouette of trees on the bank, and the slow, rhythmic breathing that came with hours of calm observation. It was a job tailor-made for insomniacs, philosophers, people who enjoyed solitude, and individuals who preferred rivers to conversation, which is a surprisingly large demographic in medieval history. The end of a watch. A watcher's shift ended just before dawn. They extinguished their lantern, wrote a final note on water levels, stroked their beard or cloak in that satisfied, nothing happened tonight way, and went home to sleep while everyone else was just waking up. Their work created a strange kind of stability, a gentle, ongoing awareness of the river's moods, helping millers, merchants, and millwrights prepare for the day ahead. Quiet, unnoticed, steady. The perfect corner of history to fall asleep to. Now, by the time we drift into Chapter 9, I think we've officially entered that curious twilight zone of history where nothing particularly dramatic happens, yet somehow everything is quietly shifting underneath the surface. This is the realm I like to call the whispered economy, the systems of trade, exchange, favor swapping, and object circulation that kept entire societies running long before anyone bothered to write the rules down. You see, for every grand marketplace filled with polished coins and official weights, there were 10 little corners of daily life operating on reputations, murmured agreements, and the occasional baked pastry used to settle debts. And if you're thinking, surely that's an exaggeration, well, actually no. In several medieval towns, a warm loaf of barley bread was just as legitimate a form of payment as a copper coin, especially if the baker was someone everyone trusted more than the local mint. So let's zoom into one of these small, soft-spoken economies. Picture a little street, any street, somewhere on the far fringe of a medieval town. The kind of place where the cobblestones aren't quite evenly set, and where stray chickens have unironically achieved the rank of unofficial residents. These weren't the glamorous districts. They were the side alleys where shoes were mended, wool was combed, candles were swapped, and gossip was arguably more valuable than silver. And everyone, absolutely everyone, had their own way of navigating the invisible flow of value. The cobbler, for instance, wasn't just fixing shoes. Oh no. He was also the keeper of tiny social balances. He knew whose work boots had worn thin because they were walking longer routes for extra wages. He knew whose fancy shoes sat untouched because the family had quietly lost money and no longer attended social gatherings. He knew which customers would never pay him in coins but always repaid him eventually with something more useful, like a sturdy piece of leather, or the whispered tip that the tax collector would be in a bad mood that week. The candle maker down the street was even more interesting. The candles, believe it or not, were currency in their own odd way. Not officially, of course. No medieval clerk would say, "Yes, that'll be 2 candles and a half tallow wick." But if you lived in a place where daylight fades around 4 in the afternoon, a candle wasn't just a household supply, it was the difference between a usable evening and sitting in darkness contemplating your life choices. Which means people traded for candles with surprising seriousness. One elderly widow became somewhat locally famous for her candle credit system. She would keep tallies on split wooden boards, 1 notch for a taper, 2 for a beeswax candle, 3 for a large dipped batch. People borrowed light as though it were gold. And she kept her records with the solemn, meticulous energy of someone managing a royal treasury. Then you had the wool carders, those quiet craftspeople tasked with turning raw wool into something even remotely workable. These folks were living embodiments of the whispered economy because wool, quite literally, passed through countless hands and debts before it ever became a finished garment. A farmer might pay a shepherd in wool. The shepherd might pay the carder in raw fleece. The carder might pay a friend by gifting the fluffiest handful. And that friend might barter it for fresh vegetables at a tiny market stall that did not technically exist on any official map. What's remarkable, and honestly kind of soothing, is how stable this whole unofficial system was. Nobody wrote laws about it. Nobody appointed overseers. It just worked because people quietly, collectively agreed to let it work. And hovering above all this, like a soft but persistent wind, was the deep understanding that value didn't always need to be declared. Sometimes it was negotiated through nods, glances, shared memories, and that "I'll owe you one" tone of voice. Which brings us to one of my favorite little historical quirks, the unspoken favor chains. This was a common phenomenon in small communities across Europe, North Africa, Persia, and Southeast Asia. Essentially, a person would do something as tiny as lending a bucket or helping patch a roof tile, and years later someone else entirely, someone they barely knew, would repay that favor because the community had quietly kept track of it. Not in writing. Not in any official ledger. Just in the shared consciousness of people who lived close enough to overhear each other's windows. Even more fascinating? These chains of favors could span generations. You might receive unexpected help from a neighbor because, as someone's grandmother put it, "Your mother once brought my mother barley soup during the winter of the long rains." And that was that. Debt paid. Balance restored. Soup as economic policy. Modern economists would absolutely lose their minds trying to diagram this on a whiteboard. But the beauty of the whispered economy lies in its simplicity. It didn't pretend to be grand. It didn't demand recognition. It worked quietly, almost shyly, in the background. And it kept entire communities functioning long before anyone dreamed of inventing banking systems or standardized currency exchange tables. And yet, here's the fun twist. These invisible networks were often more stable than the official economies. When kings fell, when mints debased coins, when trade routes shifted, when taxes spiked, guess what still worked? The cobbler fixing boots in exchange for a future favor. The candle lady keeping notches on her wooden tally. The wool carder settling old debts with handfuls of soft fleece. It's a reminder that, at the end of the day, human beings are remarkably good at creating systems of cooperation without ever calling them systems. Sometimes the quietest forms of organization are the most enduring. And as we ease toward the next chapter, you may notice your eyes growing heavier, not from boredom, I hope, but from that gentle coziness that comes with imagining small acts of daily life ticking along in the background of history. Because the whispered economy was never meant to be exciting. It was meant to be comforting, consistent, and quietly dependable. Just like this monologue. Now, if you've ever sat in a modern waiting room, the kind with plastic chairs, outdated magazines, and that faint smell of disinfectant that's been there since the dawn of civilization, you might assume the whole idea is relatively recent. But in reality, the art of waiting, the culture of waiting, has been shaping human daily life for centuries. It's just that nobody called these places waiting rooms. They didn't have posters reminding you to wash your hands or whispery music playing in the background. Instead, these were quiet pockets of space where time paused, people lingered, and the world went on without them for just a moment. And honestly, these early waiting spaces might have been even more soothing than their modern cousins. Let's begin with one of my favorites, the courtyard benches outside small administrative offices in late medieval cities. These weren't official offices in the grand sense, not like the king's treasury or some imposing hall of justice. No, these were modest municipal rooms where clerks handled things like verifying market weights or stamping travel permits that nobody was ever going to check. And outside, under a patch of filtered sunlight or perhaps a bit of shade, citizens would gather and wait. What's charming is that nobody seemed particularly bothered by this. People in the 14th century basically expected that any interaction with authority required at least a mild pause in their day. They would bring small tasks to occupy themselves, a bit of mending to stitch, vegetables to trim, or the kind of gentle gossip that didn't require full focus. Waiting wasn't an inconvenience. It was woven into the rhythm of life like a natural rest note. One observer from that era even wrote that the courtyard outside the clerk's office was the most peaceful place in town, for the people there have no choice but to surrender their haste. If that isn't the most sleep-inducing sentence in recorded history, I don't know what is. Another wonderful example comes from monastic guest halls, which served, unintentionally, as some of the earliest organized waiting rooms. Travelers would arrive, dusty, mildly confused, and hoping someone could point them toward the nearest road marker, and they'd be shown to a simple wooden bench while a monk fetched the guest master. And what do you do while waiting in a guest hall that's functionally identical to every other monastic hallway in Europe? You listen. To footsteps echoing down stone corridors. To a distant bell someone forgot to stop ringing. To the soft rustle of rope belts brushing against rough wool robes. It was the kind of space where even sound seemed hesitant to move too quickly. Then there were artisan shop thresholds, which absolutely count as waiting rooms even though nobody ever acknowledges it. If you brought your shoes to be repaired or your pot to be reclayed, you had a solid chance of ending up on a low stool by the door, waiting for the artisan to finish the last bit, just one moment, which inevitably took far longer than one moment. But nobody minded. Waiting was simply part of the exchange. And the most delightful part? Artisans used the presence of waiting customers as social proof. "Oh, excuse me," a potter would say to a new customer, gesturing toward the waiting bench. "As you can see, there are others ahead of you." This single sentence carried equal parts pride, apology, and a hint of, "Please admire my popularity." Even more fascinating were harborside waiting spots, those quiet ledges where travelers lingered for the next ferry or small riverboat. These weren't bustling ports, just tiny landings with a rope, a tied-up skiff, and maybe a bored goat inspecting the luggage. People sat there for hours sometimes, staring at the water with absolutely no urgency, because the schedule depended entirely on whether the ferryman had woken up yet. Some travelers would peel fruit slowly. Others would casually rebraid rope. A few would just nap upright like cats. And if you think modern public transit is unpredictable, imagine living in an era where the official ferry schedule essentially read, "Whenever." Now, possibly my favorite early waiting room tradition comes from the small medical corners of villages. Before physicians had clinics, they had porches. And patients, or rather, people who suspected they might be patients, would gather on these porches, sitting on long benches, quietly observing one another while pretending not to. It created a kind of unofficial diagnostic waiting environment where everyone became painfully aware of the fact that someone else had arrived before them. It was all extremely calm. And, in a weird way, extremely comforting. Because the shared experience of waiting made everyone equal. Rich or poor, merchant or mason, everyone sat shoulder to shoulder on the same wooden bench, listening to the same creak of floorboards and the same lightly squeaking hinge as the healers stepped in and out. What ties all these early waiting spaces together is their unhurried nature. They weren't places people resented. They were pauses. Breathing spaces. Little bubbles in time where nothing urgent needed to happen. A moment where you could finally think your own thoughts. Or stop thinking altogether. And while modern waiting rooms often try to fill the silence with screens and signs and fluorescent lights, there was something beautifully uncomplicated about the old ones. They existed because human life has always required a bit of stillness. A moment between moments. A moment where you could sit down, exhale, and let the world go quiet for a while. Which, fittingly, is exactly what we're doing here. moving through history one gentle pause at a time. Let's drift now into the warm, flour-dusted world of medieval bakeries, places that smelled like toasted grain, wood smoke, and the kind of yeast that seemed to live its own peaceful little life. Bakers were early risers, of course, but not the energetic, spring-out-of-bed kind. They were more like slow-moving dawn creatures who shuffled through the dark with a yawn and a shrug, because bread needed them, and because nobody else was going to do it. And one of their most underrated skills was listening. It's easy to imagine a medieval baker as someone who watched the dough rise, checked crust color, and squinted at the oven flames like a tired owl. But the truth is, their ears did a surprising amount of the work. Eyes were helpful, sure, but the sound of a bakery was its own quiet language. Take the dough itself. When fermenting, it made tiny, soft pops, like flowery whispers. And bakers would lean close, letting those faint sounds tell them whether the yeast was happy or whether it was, once again, having one of its famous sulky moments. Medieval yeast was temperamental. It didn't behave according to charts or predictable rising times. It behaved according to vibes. So bakers adapted. They listened. A bubbly, lively dough meant the day might actually go smoothly. A sluggish, barely audible dough meant trouble. And dough that made no sound at all meant the yeast had probably died sometime during the night, which was typical. Deliciously typical. Even the wooden troughs had voices. The creak of the boards shifting under the pressure of the dough gave bakers clues about hydration. A wetter dough made a deeper, slower creak, almost a sigh. A dry dough had a crisp, higher-pitched shift. Modern bakers measure moisture content. Medieval bakers simply leaned in and listened to the wood complain gently about its workload. Then there was the oven, the great domed heart of the bakery. You didn't look inside to check if it was ready. That was a terrible idea unless you wanted to scorch your eyebrows off, which happened often enough to be considered a normal occupational hazard. Instead, you listened to it. A well-heated oven hummed. Not a loud hum, just a warm, steady resonance. A slightly cooler oven offered a duller, slower reverberation. And if the oven made no sound at all, it meant the baker had forgotten something extremely important, and the morning was now ruined. Some bakers would tap the stone gently with the long peel. The resulting tone helped them know whether they'd reached that sweet spot of heat where bread would spring instead of sulk. Even the loaves had voices. A loaf fresh from the oven made a faint crackling sound as it cooled, a tiny symphony of contracting crust. Seasoned bakers claimed that a well-baked loaf crackled enthusiastically, while an underbaked loaf sounded more timid. And if a loaf was overbaked, well, it didn't crackle at all. It sat there in embarrassed silence. There were also the sounds of customers, each of them a familiar part of the daily rhythm. The soft shuffle of someone entering with a basket tucked under their arm. The little coughs people used instead of saying, hello. The clink of coins that were almost never the correct amount on the first try. And perhaps the most iconic bakery sound, the communal sigh of people waiting for the next batch to come out of the oven. They would sit on benches, exchanging small talk about weather, taxes, and the fact that the baker's apprentice looked slightly more exhausted every day. Bakeries weren't lively places. They weren't loud or bustling. They were steady, predictable. A place where the world felt slow and warm, and where the scent of rising dough softened even the grumpiest morning mood. But perhaps the most interesting auditory detail was how bakers listened for something they called the still moment. This was the pause between kneading and baking, when the bakery went quiet. No mixing, no scraping, no shifting of wood. Just a sleepy calm while the dough rested. Bakers cherished that moment. They'd sip weak ale, lean against the wall, let their tired shoulders sag just a little, because the still moment meant things were working. The dough was rising. The oven was heating. The day was gently unfolding the way it should. And if the still moment stretched on too long, well, that meant something had gone wrong. Usually the yeast, again, because medieval baking was essentially a daily argument with microorganisms. But most days the sounds lined up perfectly. The dough whispered. The wood creaked. The oven hummed. The crust crackled. A quiet chorus of small, sleepy noises that guided the baker's hands more faithfully than any timekeeping device ever could. And in this slow, steady, sound-guided world, medieval bakers found a rhythm that was oddly soothing. Predictable. Almost meditative. A rhythm that carried them through the dark mornings and into the warm, calm glow of each new day. Let's drift over to something wonderfully simple, the quiet medieval habit of just sitting by water. Not fishing. Not washing clothes. Not hauling buckets. Just sitting. Existing. Letting the mind loosen slightly, like a belt after a long meal. If you imagine medieval life as a constant cloud of urgency, fires to tend, fields to plow, goats to chase, remember that people still carved out tiny pockets of stillness. And these pockets often formed near rivers, ponds, or wells. Places where the world seemed gentler. Places where time felt slower. One of the most common spots was the village well, especially early in the morning when the air was cool and the water still. People would finish their drawing, set their buckets aside, and then simply linger. Some leaned against the low stone wall, arms draped lazily over the edge. Others sat on worn wooden planks nearby, letting their thoughts swirl like silt drifting through the water. Nobody questioned this behavior. The well was the quiet social center of village life. A place where you could stare into the distance and pretend you were contemplating something profound, when in reality you were probably thinking about absolutely nothing. Which, honestly, is the best kind of thinking. Then there were the riverbanks, which offered a wide menu of calm depending on the season. In spring, the sound was a gentle trickle. In summer, a slow glide. And in winter, the water moved so lazily it almost seemed bored with itself. People liked to sit on flat stones warmed by the sun. They would trail their fingertips in the water, watching tiny ripples drift away like sleepy messengers. Children napped against tree roots. Elderly folks leaned on their walking sticks, letting the steady drone of water soothe whatever aches had moved in overnight. And every so often, someone would let out one of those long, soft sighs that only happen when no one expects anything from you. Even the mills had their share of peaceful sitting spots, especially when the miller wasn't running the wheel at full speed. The little platforms beside the mill race were some of the best unofficial relaxation zones in medieval towns. People would perch there, enjoying the rhythmic slosh of water as it glided toward the wheel. The sound was steady and hypnotic, almost like the water was humming to itself. Miller's apprentices sat there often, usually because they were taking a break from endlessly lifting sacks of grain. They'd let their hands rest in their laps, staring at the water's lazy churn and mentally drifting somewhere far, far away from responsibility. Possibly imagining a world where sacks of grain lifted themselves. One of the loveliest and sleepiest places to sit was the edge of a pond, especially those in monastery gardens. These ponds were deliberately quiet spaces, designed for contemplation, reflection, and the occasional escape from overly talkative brothers inside the cloister. Monks would sit on simple wooden benches or low stone borders, their robes pooling around them like blankets. Sometimes they read. Sometimes they dozed. Sometimes they just watched carp glide lazily in the water, looking like fish that had never once experienced excitement of any kind. A monk from the late 13th century wrote in his diary that the garden pond was a refuge where thoughts wander like clouds. And honestly, that's about as medieval and as sleep-inducing as it gets. Even more charming were the small, unnoticed water channels that ran between houses in certain towns. These little streams carried runoff or fed gardens, and people would sit beside them in the evenings, enjoying the subtle trickle as the day settled into dusk. It was the medieval equivalent of white noise, except naturally sourced and considerably less expensive. But perhaps the most intriguing sight was seeing someone simply existing near water without any apparent reason. No tasks. No tools. No goals. Just the universal human expression of, "I'm taking a moment." Travelers reported seeing farmers sitting by irrigation ditches after finishing their fieldwork, staring at the slow-moving water with the soft blankness of people whose minds had temporarily stopped producing thoughts. Nobles, too, despite all their marble halls and embroidered cushions, would wander out to landscaped ponds to indulge in quiet staring sessions. It didn't matter who you were. Water invited stillness. The medieval world was full of noise, clattering carts, clucking hens, people shouting at pigs, but water created pockets of calm. And people instinctively moved toward that calm, the same way we now gravitate toward rain sounds, fountains, or the hum of an aquarium filter. What's fascinating is how universal it was. Every region, every class, every century. A shared human ritual: sit near water, go quiet, and let time drift. And maybe that's why millers listened so closely for good water. Because water wasn't just a tool for turning wheels, it was a companion, a mood setter, a soft, sleepy presence that shaped daily rhythms in ways we don't always think about. In the medieval imagination, water was patient, predictable in its unpredictability, and wonderfully, effortlessly soothing. It made people pause. It made them breathe. It made them settle into themselves. Just like we're doing now, letting the river of history glide by in a slow, steady current. By now, we've wandered through quiet rivers, sleepy bakeries, and reflective ponds, so it seems only natural to take a detour into a quieter, less glamorous, but endlessly fascinating corner of medieval life: tax collectors. Yes, people who made others uncomfortable with coins, but who themselves often found very creative ways to avoid the stress. It may surprise you to learn that some medieval tax collectors were, in fact, remarkable practitioners of strategic napping. They weren't lazy. Not exactly. They were methodical, patient, masters of waiting, much like water bearers or river watchers. The rhythm of taxation. In medieval towns, taxes weren't collected with modern efficiency. There were no spreadsheets, no stamps, no formal office hours. Everything depended on walking from household to household, ledger in hand, pen or chalk ready, and politely hoping the householder remembered what they owed, or at least pretended convincingly. Tax collectors had to travel slowly. Pace was everything. Too fast, and villagers suspected impatience or dishonesty. Too slow, and they risked being late for their next stop, which, in some jurisdictions, could be punished with more paperwork. And paperwork in the 13th century was not like today's spreadsheets. It involved quills, ink pots, large sheets of parchment, and sometimes a very disgruntled assistant. So, naturally, these collectors developed a rhythm. Listen, right? Scribble. Nap again. The art of strategic napping. Let's be clear, napping wasn't slacking off. It was tactical. Tax collectors discovered that a short doze mid-route helped them prevent mistakes in recording amounts, maintain calm when villagers argued about valuations, and honestly, endure the monotony of walking past endless rows of wooden cottages, each with its own weird smell of smoke, livestock, and whatever was fermenting. Some napping spots were quite deliberate. A sturdy fence, a soft patch of grass near the market, or, in times of extreme courage, leaning against the stone walls of a church. Not sacred, just convenient. The nap was often brief, 10 minutes, maybe 15. Enough to reset the mind without losing track of accounts. A collector who napped excessively risked being accused of negligence. But a well-timed micronap? Professional mastery. Villagers' perspective. Of course, the townspeople noticed. They may have frowned at first. A tax collector snoozing beside a cart of onions or in the shadow of the well might seem odd. But in practice, people often found it oddly comforting. Ah, thought the villagers, he rests before he judges our households. That's fair. There was a subtle, unspoken agreement. Sleepy tax collectors tended to be gentler. Alert tax collectors, in contrast, often overcharged, forgot minor exemptions, or grew frustrated at trivial matters like whether a chicken counted as a taxable asset. So, in the peculiar economy of medieval taxation, the nap became a tool of diplomacy, ledger maintenance, and quiet reflection. When awake, tax collectors weren't idle. They wrote slowly, deliberately, letting ink dry before moving on. Mistakes were costly, not just in time, but in reputation. They often kept additional notes, like, house with stubborn cat, likely to argue. Mill near river, always prone to underreporting. Baker with excellent sourdough, likely to bribe subtly with pastries. Some even sketched little symbols in the margins. a sleeping moon for households prone to napping during visits, a drooping tree for those chronically late with payment. The ledger became both a work tool and a quiet reflection journal, a sleepy map of the town's rhythms and moods. Seasonal effects on collector sleepiness. Collectors' schedules were dictated by seasons. Spring, rivers swelled, roads became muddy. Walking slowly wasn't optional, it was survival. Naps extended to mid-route pauses by streams. Summer, long, hot days encouraged naps under market awnings. Ink dried slowly in the humidity, which helped justify extra breaks. Autumn, crop harvests meant longer ledgers and more arguments. Naps became strategic retreats, allowing collectors to maintain composure. Winter, cold slowed everything. Roads were icy. Napping by a chimney or haystack was standard practice. Sometimes snow delayed work entirely, which gave collectors rare opportunities for extended slumber. In short, tax collectors were intimately aware of the environment and adapted quietly, like the millers and river watchers we met earlier. The collector's legacy. By the end of a route, a medieval tax collector might be seen as a strange mix of authority and calm resignation. Villagers tolerated them. Other officials sometimes judged them. But the collector, quietly pacing and occasionally dozing, understood something vital. History was long, towns were patient, and a gentle nap could prevent countless mistakes. They were human instruments in a slow, predictable system. Their rhythm shaped village life without ever demanding attention. And their quiet naps remind us that even in a world obsessed with coins, duties, and ledgers, people still found small, gentle ways to preserve calm. It's the kind of tiny, mundane story that makes your eyelids heavier simply by imagining it, like the soft murmur of a river beside a wooden bench, or the faint crackling of a baker's oven in the morning light. Because, ultimately, history isn't just about wars, crowns, or proclamations. Sometimes, it's about quiet, ordinary patience. The kind that allows life, and sleep, to continue. Chapter 14. The softly illuminated world of candle testers. Now, let's meander into a quieter, wax-scented corner of medieval life, the realm of candle testers. Not makers, not sellers, not dramatic alchemists trying to invent eternal light. Just the people whose job it was to ensure that candles burned properly, and who, in doing so, spent hours watching little flames flicker in the gentle dark. It may sound absurdly mundane. And it is. Perfectly mundane. Which, if you're still awake, is exactly what we're aiming for. Why candle testing mattered. In medieval towns, light wasn't trivial. It dictated when people woke, when they ate, when they stitched, and, most importantly, when they didn't fall on their faces in darkness. Poorly made candles could bend, drip excessively, smoke like a chimney, or extinguish in the middle of a priestly reading. So, someone needed to watch them. Someone needed to sit quietly, holding each candle upright, noting how it burned, and occasionally adjusting the wick. Too long, and the flame was a lazy, unstable troublemaker. Too short, and it wasted expensive wax. A candle tester's work was slow, gentle, and deeply repetitive. It required patience, focus, and a certain level of existential tolerance for boredom. A day in the life of a candle tester. Morning began with wax. Lots of wax. Blocks, tallow, beeswax, sometimes blended with a little resin for stiffness. The tester would cut small pieces, form them into tapers, and place them carefully in a row. Then came the lighting. One by one, the flames were kindled. The tester adjusted wicks with delicate precision, noting how the flame danced. Sometimes it flickered lazily. Sometimes it leaned as if trying to whisper secrets to the next candle. And sometimes, of course, it sputtered and died, which was mildly embarrassing but also entirely expected. A tester didn't fuss. They didn't scold the candle. They simply made notes. Adjusted. Relit. Observed. And then, waited. Waiting was a major part of the job. Listening to wax. Yes, wax has a subtle sound. A high-quality candle would produce a soft, almost imperceptible hiss as the wick drew it upward. A flawed candle might crackle, pop, or even groan faintly under heat. The experienced tester could identify problems before the flame even hinted at failure. Some testers claimed they could tell a candle's quality blindfolded, just by listening to it burn for the first few moments. Others swore by smell. A faint resinous scent meant a smooth, even burn. A slightly tangy smell indicated impurities, usually from a hasty beeswax harvest. Either way, it was an intimate, slow engagement with an object most people barely noticed in their daily lives. The gentle rhythm of observation. Candle testing was not rushed. That would defeat the purpose. The tester watched for minutes, sometimes hours, letting the flame settle, watching the wax pool and harden. Hands rested on the table. Back leaned against the chair. Eyes half closed. Mind quiet. It was a form of meditative patience, really. The flames flickered, shadows danced softly across the wall, and the tester's thoughts drifted as gently as smoke toward the ceiling. Even minor interruptions, like a curious apprentice or a distant dog barking, were absorbed without urgency. This was a world where nothing needed to be done quickly. The candle itself dictated the pace. The subtle art of adjusting a wick. Wick trimming required careful attention. Too long, and the candle smoked, throwing soot onto the table. Too short, and the flames struggled to stay alive. The tester used scissors that were sometimes worn smooth from decades of careful clipping, cutting just enough to keep the flame happy. And if the candle didn't comply, it was noted for further correction at the melting stage. Every adjustment was small. Every observation gentle. There was no drama, no shouting, no excitement, only the soft, unbroken rhythm of human patience. Evening and reflection. By the end of the day, testers often had dozens of candles fully evaluated. Some were perfect. Most were acceptable. A few were doomed, forever destined to be dim and smoky. They cleaned their station, extinguished any stray flames, and quietly, perhaps allowed themselves a moment to watch the surviving candles burn just a little longer. Watching fire behaving themselves, and feeling the slow satisfaction that comes from attending to small, delicate details in an otherwise noisy world. It is, in many ways, a job perfectly suited to sleepiness. Observing something flicker and fade while the mind floats along, gently, patiently, inevitably, toward rest. And as we leave the candle tester to their quiet corner, it's worth noting that the soft, rhythmic repetition of their work echoes the quiet histories we've been following. Millers listening for water, bakers listening to dough, river watchers listening to rivers. It is a world defined not by dramatic action, but by slow attentiveness, calm observation, and the gentle passage of time. Perfect fuel for a sleepy mind. Now, let's wander into the quiet, herb-scented corners of medieval towns. Apothecaries' shops. Not the bustling marketplaces, not the physician's dramatic consultations, just the apothecary quietly grinding, mixing, and measuring in a haze of dried herbs and calm patience. Apothecaries were part scientist, part perfumer, and part philosopher. And, most importantly for our purposes, part slow observer of the world. The daily rhythm. A medieval apothecary's day began before most townsfolk had fully stirred. Windows were dark, the street was quiet, and the air smelled faintly of herbs left drying overnight. Apothecaries would arrange their jars and vials, checking that nothing had spilled or decayed. They weren't rushed. Everything was measured in grams or pinches, but in a medieval sense, that was mostly an art rather than a science. And so the day unfolded slowly, grinding roots into powder, crushing dried flowers, stirring solutions until they reached the desired consistency, carefully pouring liquids into small, labeled bottles. Each action was deliberate, unhurried, and accompanied by soft exhalations, the kind you make when you are very aware that nothing is particularly urgent. Listening and smelling as much as seeing. Apothecaries weren't just visually attentive, they listened and smelled. A subtle hiss when a herb hit boiling water could indicate readiness. The gentle crackle of crushed leaves could warn that something had gone too dry or too coarse. A whiff of an herb could tell whether it had been stored correctly. Modern chemists might laugh, imagining that it's unscientific. But medieval apothecaries trusted experience, intuition, and a sort of sleepy wisdom that only comes from years of observing quiet transformations. Customers and gentle observations. Visits from townsfolk were infrequent but deliberate. People came for remedies for headaches, minor cuts, stomach issues, or that vague feeling off that medicine, even now, sometimes struggles to explain. The apothecary rarely rushed them. They listened carefully to symptoms, nodded slowly, and sometimes quietly sighed. Yes, this is a mild imbalance, they might say. We shall grind some rosemary and mix it gently with honey. Nothing dramatic, but it will soothe. No shouting. No sudden revelations. Just calm, patient attention, almost like a soft lullaby delivered through words and gestures. The subtle art of herb blending. Blending herbs wasn't like cooking. It wasn't noisy, nor did it involve dramatic fire. Each blend required patience. Counting leaves. Grinding slowly. Weighing powders carefully against small stones or brass scales. Mixing with liquids just so, letting them settle. Apothecaries developed a rhythm. They could blend multiple remedies in a single session without ever hurrying. Each step was a gentle meditation on form, texture, and scent. Even the sound of mortar and pestle had a calming quality, the soft circular grind echoing softly, a reassuring constant in a world of unpredictable carts, barking dogs, and random clanging of distant blacksmiths. The quiet risks. Some herbs could be mildly toxic if mismeasured, but apothecaries approached this with calm pragmatism. Mistakes weren't dramatic, they were minor inconveniences that required careful correction. Yes, that one is slightly stronger than intended, they might mumble to themselves. Adjust tomorrow. For now, breathe. It's notable how little panic was involved. Everything could be fixed with slow, deliberate work and a patient mind. Evening at the apothecary. By evening, jars and vials were lined up neatly. Powdered herbs rested in small bowls. Liquids settled quietly. And the apothecary, shoulders relaxed, might stand for a moment, inhale the soft scent of chamomile, lavender, and rosemary, and reflect on the day. No rush. No urgency. Just the quiet satisfaction that everything was in order, that the remedies would help those who came tomorrow, and that the small, calm world of the apothecary functioned perfectly if approached gently. It's easy to imagine leaning back in a chair beside a window, sunlight fading over the jars, and just letting your mind float alongside the slow, rhythmic patterns of their day. And really, that's exactly what makes medieval apothecaries such excellent companions for sleep-inducing history. Their work wasn't about grand events or dramatic stories. It was about steady, slow attentiveness, observation, and quiet care. Perfectly mundane. Perfectly soothing. Perfectly the kind of story that lets your eyelids droop gently as history continues to move softly around you. By the time we arrive at Chapter 16, we've already explored rivers, bakeries, candle-lit workshops, and apothecaries. Now it's time to drift alongside another quietly essential profession, medieval postmen. Yes, they existed, not the mounted couriers of epic romance, not the knights delivering secret missives, but the everyday walkers, trudging through villages and towns, carrying messages that were surprisingly unimportant most of the time. And their secret superpower? Slowness. The pace of delivery. Medieval postmen weren't racing against the clock. They didn't have standardized routes or strict schedules. Mail didn't matter that urgently. Letters were often simple notes from one local merchant to another. Your flour shipment is delayed. Bring an extra candle tomorrow. Please repay the favor you owe. These messages moved at a pace dictated by legs, weather, and occasional curiosity about passing villagers. It was common for postmen to arrive long after the sender had forgotten what they even wrote. And that, apparently, was just fine. Walking as observation. Walking slowly had its advantages. Postmen became unintentional observers of daily life. They noticed which villagers were tending their gardens with extra care, which roofs had new thatch, which chickens seemed particularly determined to escape. All minor details. All delightful for a sleepy mind. They were the quiet eyes of the town. Some postmen developed a gentle rhythm. 1 step, listen to the wind rustle through trees. 2 steps, count the flowers. 3 steps, consider if the creek looked higher than yesterday. They carried messages, but also a steady, observational calm that few others possessed. the soundtrack of slow delivery. No dramatic drumbeats, no clattering horses. Mostly, soft crunch of dirt or gravel. The gentle slap of wooden clogs or leather boots. Occasional distant bark of a dog or the clink of a blacksmith's hammer. Whispering wind through narrow streets. This was a profession that encouraged mindfulness, long before anyone had invented the concept. Every step was deliberate, every pause a chance to observe, and every delivery a tiny connection in the quiet network of a town. The letters and their sleepy contents. Most letters were utterly mundane. Bills, trade arrangements, invitations to church gatherings, apologies for minor slights, or reminders about unpaid favors. Very occasionally, a noble would write a formal notice, but even these were mostly ceremonial, read aloud slowly, and then filed somewhere, forgotten for years. The postman often grew fond of the letters themselves. Some would read the envelopes or memorize the contents, not to meddle, but out of idle curiosity. Sometimes, they would sigh softly at the repetition, "Ah yes, another notice about unpaid barley." And sometimes, they smiled quietly at human stubbornness. "She still hasn't repaid the candle debt from last spring." Seasonal variations. Spring, muddy paths slowed them down further, which was perfect for long observation walks. Summer, sun warmed their backs. The air smelled faintly of hay and river water. Stops were longer because people were outdoors, and greetings required small pauses. Autumn, fallen leaves made footsteps quieter. They could sneak along unnoticed, absorbing the sleepy patterns of rural life. Winter, snow muffled sounds and slowed motion, encouraging postmen to linger beside fires or lean against sheltered walls while waiting to resume their deliveries. In all seasons, the slow pace encouraged reflection, gentle observation, and a gradual connection to the rhythm of the village. The postman's quiet legacy. A postman's influence was subtle. They were connectors, but not in a flashy way. They kept the slow pulse of correspondence alive. They bore messages, observed life, and carried the small hum of daily routine from one household to the next. No one noticed when they passed, except perhaps a dog or two, but the rhythm of their walk shaped the tiny cadence of medieval towns. And in a way, that rhythm echoes the calm, mundane, quietly absorbing stories we've been following: millers listening to water, bakers listening to dough, apothecaries listening to herbs. The postmen remind us that history isn't just battles, crowns, or proclamations. Sometimes, it's about the gentle, methodical persistence of ordinary people, walking slowly, observing quietly, and connecting the world in the softest possible ways. And that, really, is exactly the kind of story that invites your mind to drift. Step by slow step. Breath by calm breath. We've already spent time with millers, river watchers, bakers, and even postmen, all moving slowly through their quiet rhythms. Now, let's settle into the world of millwrights, those slightly mysterious, quietly competent folks who kept the medieval mills spinning. Not dramatic engineers, not loud inventors, just calm, methodical caretakers of water and gears. Millwrights were responsible for the machinery, but their work was as much about listening as it was about hammering or adjusting. And because water moves predictably yet slowly, their workdays matched the pace of the rivers and wheels they tended. Daily life by the mill. A typical morning started with the soft slap of water against the mill wheel. The millwright would approach, peering at the wooden gears, listening to the rhythm of the wheel turning, noting whether the flow was steady or slightly off-tempo. They didn't rush. They didn't fuss. Millwrights had learned that hurrying usually resulted in cracked cogs or splintered shafts. Instead, they moved deliberately, tightening joints gently, sanding wood until it fit snugly, oil and grease applied sparingly, with a soft hand. Sometimes they paused for long stretches, hands resting on hips or on a tool, just listening. The quiet hum of water and wood became a sort of meditation. The language of gears and water. Millwright spoke in a language only partly verbal. Most of it came from sound. A rhythmic clatter meant the wheel was in good form. A slightly uneven squeak indicated minor misalignment. A stubborn groan suggested that the next few days might involve a bit of extra sanding or replacement. Water itself spoke too. High water pressed harder on the paddles. Low water moved lazily, almost sulking. The millwright adjusted accordingly, always gently, always patiently. It wasn't exciting, but it worked. And it required deep, sleepy attention. Tools of the trade. The millwright's toolkit was simple, unassuming, and worn smooth from years of gentle use. Wooden mallets for coaxing beams into place. Hand-forged hammers for nails and pins. Wooden wedges for alignment. Oil and tallow for quiet lubrication. Nothing flashy. Nothing dramatic. And nothing noisy. Loud tools would upset the rhythm of the mill and the quiet atmosphere the millwright depended on to concentrate. Apprentices and quiet mentorship. Millwrights often worked with apprentices, but even teaching was unhurried. One would stand beside the master, observing, occasionally holding a tool correctly while the master adjusted a cog. No shouting. No urgency. Just slow demonstration, small adjustments, repeated gestures, and long pauses for reflection. The apprenticeship was as much about absorbing patience as it was about learning to use a mallet. Seasonal patterns. Spring. Rushing water from melting snow required extra vigilance. Millwrights checked wheels more often but still moved slowly, letting the water dictate the pace. Summer. Lower water levels demanded gentle nudging of paddles and sometimes temporary repairs. The slow rhythm of the river kept work steady but calm. Autumn. Fallen leaves and debris required careful cleaning. Millwrights took their time, sweeping slowly and methodically. Winter. Ice made wheels sluggish. Repairs were minor and slow, often waiting for the ice to soften before acting. Every season had its pace. Millwrights simply followed along. The meditative nature of millwrighting. Perhaps the most notable feature of a millwright's life was the constant meditation on quiet repetition. Tighten, test, adjust, listen, repeat. Hours passed with minimal outward movement, but inside, the mind was calm, alert, and slightly sleepy. Millwrights understood, intuitively, that the best work could not be rushed. They treated the wheel, the gears, and the water like careful companions, demanding attention but never panic. It's a soothing image. A person leaning over a gently spinning wheel, the river humming beside them, hands occasionally nudging wood into place, and the day moving forward at the soft, unremarkable pace of life itself. The millwrights remind us once again that medieval history wasn't always about dramatic kings or battles. Sometimes it was about quiet observation, patient adjustment, and a gentle awareness of the rhythms of life. Exactly the kind of stories that make your eyelids heavier as the world outside your window slows down. By now, we've walked alongside millers, bakers, apothecaries, and postmen, all moving through life at a pace that is, frankly, ideal for quiet contemplation. Now it's time to meet a group of people whose jobs were officially important but often executed with gentle lethargy, the medieval night watchers. Yes, these were the guards and watchmen tasked with keeping towns and villages safe once the sun went down. Their responsibility was technically crucial. Their actual work was mostly sitting, standing, pacing slowly, and napping when possible. The rhythm of night watching. A typical night began as darkness fell. Lanterns were lit. Streets emptied. Dogs barked sporadically, mostly at nothing. The night watcher took their post, often on a wooden platform, near a gate or along a town wall. And then they waited. Long stretches of silence, broken occasionally by a passing traveler murmuring greetings. The soft clatter of an animal. The distant murmur of the river or wind through the trees. Mostly, however, nothing happened. And the night watcher knew better than to rush. Napping on duty. Napping was not merely a convenience, it was a practical necessity. Towns were quiet, emergencies rare, and the human mind does not naturally stay fully alert for 6 hours straight without some gentle rest. So watchmen developed what might be called strategic micronaps. A slow lean against the wall. Head nodding briefly over the shoulder. Occasional stretching to wake up, followed by immediate resumption of the sitting or pacing routine. The trick was to nap just enough to remain functional but not so deeply that the town actually noticed. Tools and companions of the night. Night watchers carried simple tools. A lantern or torch. A long staff or halberd, mostly symbolic because serious trouble rarely appeared. Occasionally a whistle, which was used sparingly if ever. Most companions were silent, dogs on leashes, cats wandering past, or even fellow night watchers who shared the subtle art of pacing slowly while nodding off at the same time. The night was their rhythm. The soft hum of distant wind and dripping water became their soundtrack. Watching without seeing. It's worth noting that night watchers rarely saw much. Streets were dark. Towns were mostly quiet. And any actual crime or mischief tended to happen elsewhere. Instead, they watched in a very passive sense, listening for unusual sounds, observing shadows that seemed slightly out of place, occasionally making a note of a flickering lantern or stray animal. Much of their day, or rather, night, was spent observing the natural lull of human activity. And because they were so accustomed to it, they often blended into the quiet night as if they were part of the architecture. Seasonal variations. Winter, longer nights meant more opportunity for gentle nodding, bundled cloaks, and slow circulation of air near fires. Summer, short nights encouraged slow pacing to stay awake. Lanterns dimmed gradually as the sky lightened. Autumn, fallen leaves muffled footsteps, making silence even more pronounced. Spring, the occasional bird singing too early would rouse a watchman briefly, before returning to gentle observation. No matter the season, night watchers found ways to maintain vigilance without exertion. It was an unhurried, low-stress form of service. The sleepy legacy of night watchers. Despite their official role, night watchers contributed quietly to the rhythm of town life. Their presence maintained a sense of security, yet their methods remind us that medieval work was often gentle, unhurried, and meditative. Standing, sitting, pacing, listening, napping. These were the essential activities that shaped the night without fanfare. And in imagining them, we find ourselves slipping into the same calm, rhythmic pace, slowly drifting alongside history itself. As we move through quiet corners of medieval life, it's time to revisit something intimately familiar yet wonderfully mundane: candle makers. Not testers, not elaborate chandlery shops for nobles, but everyday candle makers, the ones who shaped wax into gentle light for ordinary homes, monasteries, and shops. And yes, their lives were slow, meditative, and occasionally whispery. The gentle craft of wax. Candle making was not a hasty task. Wax needed to be melted just so, poured carefully, and left to cool without rush. Too hot, and it would deform. Too cold, and the wick would fail. Each action required patience, small gestures, and a steady hand. Some makers even spoke softly to the wax. Not to enchant it, though one can imagine a tired medieval superstition, but as a rhythm for their own movements. Slow now, gently. Settle, don't rush. This whispering kept their hands steady and their minds calm. Daily rhythm. A typical day began with preparation. Melting blocks of beeswax or tallow over gentle fires. Preparing molds or rolling sheets carefully. Arranging wicks and measuring length with quiet precision. Nothing was hurried. Each step was deliberate, almost ritualistic. Watching wax melt slowly, seeing it settle in molds, and feeling the slight resistance when rolling it into sheets became their meditation. Sounds and smells. Candle makers' workshops had a unique auditory landscape. The faint hiss of wax on a gentle flame. The soft clink of tools against molds. Occasional scraping of cooled wax from surfaces. And the smell, warm, faintly sweet, calming. A mixture of beeswax, tallow, and herbs occasionally added for scent. The atmosphere was cozy, inviting, and unhurried, a sensory lullaby. Apprenticeship and quiet observation. Apprentices learned slowly, guided by example rather than instruction. They watched masters pour slowly, never rushing. Learned to judge temperature by sight and touch. Practiced whispering quietly to themselves while molding. No yelling, no dramatic corrections. Mistakes were met with calm adjustments and gentle repetition. Seasonal influences. Winter, longer nights meant more candle use, and slower workdays encouraged steady pacing. Summer, heat required caution, wax melted quickly, so movements were deliberate and measured. Spring and autumn, Ambient temperatures allowed for more relaxed pouring and longer observation of cooling candles. Every season dictated a subtle change in pace, reinforcing the meditative rhythm of the craft. The meditative legacy of candle makers. Candle makers remind us that much of medieval life wasn't about drama or danger. It was about patience, rhythm, and attention to subtle, slow-moving processes. Watching wax settle, shaping light by hand, and whispering softly to the molten material, they created not just candles, but quiet spaces in which people could live, work, and eventually sleep. And in imagining them, we can feel ourselves slowing, eyelids drooping, mind floating gently alongside history itself, warm wax, soft sounds, and the faint scent of calm enveloping the scene. We've already wandered through rivers, mills, bakeries, candle workshops, and napping night watchers, so now let's drift into the quiet world of medieval scribes. Not the famous illuminators or calligraphers who created dazzling manuscripts for nobles, but the everyday scribes whose days were spent writing, copying, and observing with deliberate slowness. Their lives were perfect for the kind of soft, rhythmic history that gently lulls a mind toward sleep. The daily ritual of writing. A scribe's day began with the simple preparation of materials. Scraping parchment carefully to remove any residual bumps. Preparing ink, usually by grinding pigments and mixing them with water or egg whites. Sharpening quills and trimming them to the perfect angle. Each of these steps was slow, measured, and intentional. Mistakes were laborious to fix, so careful attention was mandatory, and hasty movements were avoided at all costs. The sound of the scriptorium. Scribes worked in spaces that were intentionally quiet. The dominant sounds were subtle and rhythmic. The scratch of quill against parchment. The soft tapping of a ruler or straight edge to align lines. The faint brushing of ink to correct a tiny error. These small, repetitive noises created a lullaby-like ambience. Visitors to a scriptorium might have commented on the monotony, but the scribes found it meditative, even comforting. The art of slow copying. Copying texts wasn't just about transcribing words. It was about carefully observing the spacing of letters, judging the thickness of lines and the flow of ink, occasionally pausing to let ink dry fully before turning the page. Some scribes would hum softly or mutter the words under their breath. This wasn't distraction, it was part of maintaining a steady rhythm, like a slow heartbeat for their hand and mind. Apprentices and gentle guidance. Apprentices learned by watching and imitating. Masters rarely shouted. Corrections were whispered. A little slower, let the quill glide. Don't rush the loops of your letters, it will come naturally. Mistakes were treated as minor lessons, not crises. This slow, calm instruction reinforced the overall rhythm of the scriptorium. Seasonal and environmental influences. Winter, the low light from short days meant lanterns and candles were used, requiring careful attention to shadows and glare. Summer, warm, long days encouraged extended observation of ink drying naturally. Autumn, cooler air slowed the drying process slightly, promoting even more patience. Spring, soft sunlight streaming through windows helped scribes maintain a gentle pace without strain. Every season subtly shaped the scribe's workflow, encouraging calm, deliberate work rather than rushed or forced movements. The meditative power of slow writing. Scribes remind us that history isn't only forged in grand battles or dramatic proclamations. Sometimes, it's built in tiny, careful acts. The slow movement of a quill, the patient observation of ink, the meditative attention to parchment. Through their meticulous, repetitive work, scribes preserved knowledge, created order from chaos, and, perhaps unintentionally, crafted a rhythm perfectly suited to gentle, sleep-inducing contemplation. The scratch of quill on parchment, the soft hush of the scriptorium, the smell of ink and parchment, it all contributes to a slow, calming heartbeat of history, one that drifts alongside us as our own eyelids grow heavier and the world outside becomes quieter. Having wandered through the quiet worlds of scribes, candle makers, millwrights, and night watchers, let's now drift into the gently soaked world of medieval launderers. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but endlessly rhythmic in their slow, methodical routines. These were the people responsible for washing, drying, and maintaining clothes, sheets, and towels, often in rivers, ponds, or at communal washhouses. And while it may seem mundane, there is a subtle art to listening to linen. The rhythm of washing. Launderers began early. Water was cold, so hands needed time to adjust. Cloth was beaten, scrubbed, and rinsed slowly, following a rhythm dictated by the nature of the fabric, the river, and the weather. Step 1. Soak gently. Step 2. Knead and rub. Step 3. Rinse and wring. Step 4. Repeat. It was repetitive, steady, and remarkably soothing once you became accustomed to the pace. Every action flowed naturally into the next. Listening to linen. Yes, linen makes noise if you listen carefully. A crisp, healthy sheet made a faint swish when plunged into water. A worn or weak piece of cloth groaned slightly when stretched. Heavy wool muttered softly as it was pounded on river stones. Launderers learned to interpret these subtle sounds. A strong sheet would survive the wash. A fragile one required extra care. Listening was more efficient than guessing or rushing. Tools and techniques. Wooden paddles, for beating stubborn stains. Stone slabs, smooth surfaces for rubbing delicate cloth. Buckets and basins, simple containers for soaking. Nothing fancy. Nothing fast. Every movement measured, deliberate, and slow. The gentle rhythm of dipping, pounding, rinsing, and wringing became almost hypnotic. Seasonal influence. Winter, ice-cold rivers slowed work, hands numb but movements rhythmic. Summer, sun-dried sheets quickly, allowing for slightly faster, yet still measured, activity. Spring, melted snow made rivers stronger. Launderers timed their work to avoid being soaked themselves. Autumn, falling leaves occasionally clung to wet fabric, requiring careful removal, but nothing rushed. Each season dictated its own gentle tempo, and launderers adapted naturally. The social element. Communal washing areas allowed for soft conversation, though not loud gossip. Mostly, people exchanged brief remarks about weather, water levels, and which neighbors had stubborn stains that would not yield. Even these small social interactions followed the slow rhythm of the work, dipping, scrubbing, swishing, wringing. No one rushed. No one shouted. Meditative observations. By the end of a day, launderers often paused to admire their work, lines of drying sheets, sparkling under the sun or moonlight, the faint rustle of fabric in a gentle breeze. It was repetitive, simple, and calming, a reminder that history isn't just made by grand events or noble declarations. Sometimes, it's made by small, consistent actions performed with attention, patience, and care. The medieval launderer embodies this perfectly, listening to linen, feeling water move over hands, and allowing the slow flow of routine to shape the day. And as we drift along with them, it's easy to feel the weight of the day soften, the mind quiet, and the body ready to settle into sleep alongside these gentle, unnoticed rhythms. After rivers, scribes, candle makers, and launderers, it's time to settle beside the quiet, wood-scented world of medieval coopers. These were the craftsmen responsible for barrels, casks, and wooden containers, the very vessels that carried ale, wine, grain, and all sorts of mundane essentials. And while their work may seem straightforward, it's filled with a gentle rhythm that invites the mind to slow down. The daily rhythm of the cooper. A cooper's day began in a workshop filled with wood shavings, the scent of fresh oak, and the faint smell of tar or pitch. Every step was deliberate. Selecting the right wood staves. Shaping them carefully with mallet and adze. Fitting them snugly into hoops. Testing for leaks with slow, methodical pours of water. There was no rush. Misalignment could ruin a cask, and the wood, once bent or split, demanded patience. Each action required attention, calm hands, and a slow, deliberate mind. Listening to wood. Wood has its own subtle sounds. A well-fitted stave makes a soft click or whisper when set into place. A stubborn piece groans gently when coaxed with a mallet. The cooper listens attentively, adjusting rhythm and pressure according to these tiny signals. It's a quiet form of conversation, human and wood, negotiating gently, patiently, without raising voices. Tools and techniques. Mallets, to tap staves gently into alignment. Hoops, iron or wooden bands that hold everything together. Adzes and knives, for shaping and smoothing. Water buckets, for testing leaks and swelling wood. Every tool is simple, familiar, and used with a quiet, practiced patience. The act of shaping and joining is almost meditative, a conversation in tactile rhythm between hand, tool, and material. Seasonal influences. Winter, cold made wood less flexible, so coopers worked more slowly, often indoors near gentle fires. Summer, warmer air allowed wood to bend more easily, letting the pace pick up slightly, though still measured. Spring, damp weather meant careful attention to swelling wood, tasks unfolded at a patient pace. Autumn, dry air required subtle adjustments, ensuring the casks would remain tight and functional. Every season shaped the cooper's rhythm, encouraging an unhurried pace aligned with the natural properties of wood. Apprentices and quiet mentorship. Apprentices learned by watching, imitating, and practicing. Masters rarely shouted. Corrections were soft. Gently now, let the stave sit. Patience, it will bend in its own time. The emphasis was always on observation and slow adjustment rather than speed. Mistakes were minor lessons in persistence. The meditative nature of cooperage. By the end of the day, a cooper might stand back and admire a finished barrel, noting the quiet satisfaction of a perfect fit. There's a rhythm here that mirrors the work of millers, candle makers, scribes, and launderers. Repetition, patience, observation, and gentle attention to detail. Every tap, every click, every whispered adjustment reminds us that much of medieval life wasn't about spectacle. It was about steady, mindful craftsmanship. And as we imagine the cooper tapping a stave into place, the soft wood yielding gradually, it's easy to feel the world slow, your own mind soften, and a gentle drift towards sleep take hold. We've drifted alongside scribes, candle makers, millwrights, launderers, and coopers. Now let's step into a quieter, almost ethereal corner of medieval towns, the lamplighters. These were the people tasked with lighting and maintaining street lamps, lanterns, and other sources of nighttime illumination. Their lives moved at a deliberate, hushed pace, perfectly suited to a sleepy mind. The rhythm of lighting. Lamplighters began work in the late afternoon, when the sun had softened but not fully disappeared. Their steps were slow and measured, carrying ladders, torches, and sometimes small containers of oil. The rhythm of their work was almost ceremonial. Climb the ladder carefully. Light the lamp. Check for leaks or weak flames. Adjust the wick. Step down slowly, moving to the next lamp. Each motion was deliberate, a slow dance that allowed time for thought and observation. Watching and listening. Lamplighters weren't just lighting lamps, they were observing the streets. In the dim glow, they could notice a stray cat slipping silently across a wall, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, villagers finishing their evening routines, often unaware of the soft light enveloping them. They listened to the soft flicker of flames and the occasional hiss of oil, using these subtle cues to adjust wicks and prevent small flare-ups. It was a quiet attentiveness that required patience and care. Tools of the trade. Torches or long-handled lamps, to ignite and reach high lanterns. Oil containers, small, manageable, carefully poured. Ladders, sturdy and used with calm precision. Cloths or snuffers, for adjusting flames without smudging or wasting oil. Every tool encouraged slow, careful work. Rushing could mean spills, minor burns, or lamps that didn't last the night. Seasonal variations. Winter, longer nights required more lamps, but also more careful pacing. Cold oil moved sluggishly. Summer, shorter nights allowed for relaxed, unhurried movement. Spring and autumn, transitional seasons required attentiveness to damp weather, wind, and varying light. The changing seasons dictated the tempo, reinforcing the calm, rhythmic nature of their labor. Apprentices and mentorship. As with many medieval trades, lamplighters often trained apprentices. Guidance was slow and quiet. Step carefully, the ladder holds, but don't rush. Notice the flicker before adjusting the wick. Move with the rhythm of the flame, not against it. Teaching focused on observation and patience, rather than speed or dramatic displays of skill. The meditative legacy of lamplighting. By the end of a night, the streets were softly illuminated, shadows dancing gently across walls. The lamplighters' slow, deliberate movements had transformed darkness into calm light. There's a quiet poetry in imagining them walking from lamp to lamp, each step unhurried, each flame tended with care. Their work reminds us once again that much of medieval life consisted of slow, attentive, meditative routines, perfect for a drifting, sleepy mind. And as we watch the flickering light fade into the night, it's easy to let our own thoughts soften, eyes grow heavy, and drift gently alongside the rhythm of history itself. We've walked beside scribes, candlemakers, millwrights, launderers, coopers, and lamplighters, all moving through life in slow, measured rhythms. Now, let's pause at the quiet, resonant world of medieval bell ringers. These were the people responsible for marking the passage of time, announcing services, and signaling events, not with haste, but with deliberate care and attention. The daily rhythm of the bell tower. A bell ringer's day was defined by sound, or more precisely by the careful control of it. Bells were heavy, slow to move, and demanded attention. Ropes were pulled gently and evenly. Pull too quickly, and the bell would swing unpredictably, creating a harsh clang. Too slowly, and it wouldn't resonate fully. The work was rhythmic and methodical. Ascend the narrow wooden stairs of the bell tower. Inspect ropes and clappers. Pull gently to test the bell's swing. Strike in measured patterns according to the hour or service. Pause, adjust, repeat. Every motion was precise, deliberate, and slow, like a physical meditation in sound. Listening and observing. Bell ringers listened constantly. The sound of the bell told them if the ropes were taut enough, if the clapper struck evenly, or if the bell itself required minor adjustments. They also observed the world below. From the top of the tower, villages looked serene, smoke rising lazily from chimneys, livestock grazing quietly, villagers finishing their daily chores. The bell ringer moved through this scene with calm, measured attention, echoing the rhythm of the town itself. Tools and techniques. Ropes, thick, sturdy, and carefully maintained. Clappers, adjusted gently for even striking. Wooden platforms, for balance while swinging massive bells. Every tool demanded care. Sloppiness could damage ropes, misalign clappers, or even injure the ringer. Precision and patience were essential. Seasonal influence. Winter, cold air made ropes stiffer, requiring more careful handling. The clear, crisp air allowed bell sounds to travel farther, emphasizing precision. Summer, warm air softened ropes slightly, allowing a slightly more fluid rhythm. Autumn and spring, transitional temperatures required adjustment to maintain the bell's melodic consistency. The natural rhythm of seasons subtly guided the bell ringer's pace. Apprenticeship and quiet learning. Bell ringing was often taught slowly and quietly. Apprentices watched, listened, and mimicked. Guidance was gentle. Pull smoothly, let the bell swing naturally. Listen to the tone before adjusting. Every hour is the same, yet unique in its weight. The focus was never on speed or dramatics, but on attentive, mindful repetition. The meditative quality of bell work. By the end of the day, the town had been marked by soft, resonant tones. Each bell, swung carefully, became a gentle heartbeat for the village. Bell ringers remind us that history is not only in battles or court intrigue. Sometimes, it is in the steady marking of hours, the patient repetition, and the quiet, resonant work that structures daily life. Imagining the bell ringer at the top of the tower, ropes in hand, listening to the echoing tone fade into distance, encourages our own minds to slow, eyes to grow heavy, and thoughts to drift along the calm pulse of history itself.